Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Remembering Lost Species, Rituals for the Anthropocene, featuring members of Feral Theater, Emily Lawrence, Rachel Porter, and Persephone Pearl. I'm Evan Graves, Assistant Director here at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and we're just very happy you could join us today. Institute of Sacred Music is an interdisciplinary graduate center here at Yale dedicated to the study and practice of sacred music, worship, and the related arts. Today's webinar is the fourth and final in a series titled Mass Extinction, Art, Ritual, Story, and the Sacred. We have been recording the talks in this series, and you can find some of the recordings for previous webinars on the ISM's YouTube page. So please do go and take a look. Today's webinar also follows closely on the heels of the start of a new program here at the ISM, and I'm delighted to announce the launch of our Religion, Ecology, and Expressive Culture initiative. This new project seeks to foster dialogue and disseminate work by scholars, artists, leaders, and activists across all disciplines and religious and indigenous traditions who work at the intersection of religion, ecology, and the arts. I hope you can follow the link in our chat there to explore more about the initiative and our call for proposals. We will be accepting proposals for projects ranging from conferences to performances and from art exhibitions to virtual events until March 30th. And you can find more about the application process and eligibility by following that link. With that, I'd like to introduce the convener of this webinar series and our moderator for today, Dr. Ryan Dar. Dr. Dar is a postdoctoral associate in religion, ecology, and expressive culture here at the ISM. And his research and teaching studies mass extinction through the lens of theology, philosophy, and literature. So over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Welcome again, everyone, to the final webinar in our series. Throughout this series, we've been addressing the topic of mass extinction through the lens of art, ritual, story, and the sacred. We've been exploring how mass extinction has been and can be imagined and depicted. We've considered poetry, photography, painting, film, historical narratives, religious narratives. We've considered how these artistic engagements are complicit in mass extinction and accompanying injustices, and how they might spark new awareness, new action, new possibilities. This final webinar is titled Remembering Lost Species, Rituals for the Anthropocene. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Persephone Pearl, Emily Lawrence, and Rachel Porter, artists who work on issues related to biodiversity and extinction, and who co-founded Remembrance Day for Lost Species, which I discovered several years ago and have been following with great interest ever since. They'll be leading us in thinking about practices of marking, ritualizing, and remembering the species that are dying and those that are gone. Today's webinar is going to follow a slightly different pattern than our previous webinars. Rather than having multiple independent speakers, our three speakers today have coordinated their presentations. So I'm going to introduce them, and then I'll turn it over to them to present for 45 minutes. And then when they've finished, we'll have time for a Q&A. You're welcome to submit your questions in writing throughout the webinar through the Q&A function. And at the end, we'll get to as many of those as we can. So let me begin by introducing our speakers. For the past 2 decades, the Feral Theater co-directors Emily Lawrence, Rachel Porter, and Persephone Pearl have been making work together that is resilient, flexible, emphasizes accessibility, and focuses on real-life struggles. Their work is multimodal and multidisciplinary, tends to include clown, dark clown, and improvisation, and is often site-specific and sometimes closer to performance or live art. It is visual and experimental, including puppets, objects, paper, cloth, shadows, projections, and lighting. Feral Theater's performance work explores themes around biodiversity change and eco-emotions. They made the immersive Funeral for Lost Species in 2011 and founded Lost Species Day, a voluntary initiative that invites participants to host or attend memorials and events for extinct and critically endangered species, communities, and places. Over the past decade, Feral Theater has moved into a curatorial and facilitative role with Lost Species Day, steering the project away from its initial focus on endling stories through a more intersectional, anti-racist, and anti-colonial framing, amplifying diverse voices through its platform. Lost Species Day has touched many thousands of people and influenced academics, institutions, and social movements. As well as co-directing Feral Theater, Rachel, Persephone, and Emily all work separately, often with some level of collaboration and communication between them in their individual projects. So I'm really grateful that they've agreed to be here and to share with us today. And I'll now turn it over to Persephone, Emily, and Rachel.
Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Oh, it's wonderful. I've been waiting. Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel. I am an actress, a theatre maker, a performer, and an experimental artist working with photography, digital photography at the moment. I'm also a drama therapist and a drama therapy lecturer.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Loro. I'm a multidisciplinary, socially engaged artist based in Wales, and I often work with communities. My recent work has centred around Wales's historic links with transatlantic slavery, and I'm interested in the work of healing justice and currently studying for a master's in art psychotherapy.
I'm Persephone, and I'm a Brighton-based artist and producer and director and facilitator, and I've been co-leading an amazing arts organisation there, arts and environment organisation called ONCA for the last 10 years. My background is as a touring theatre and circus performer and as an educator, and I'm also now training in psychotherapy at Brighton University. I just wanted to say deep thanks to Eben and Ray and to the Yale Institute for Sacred Music for inviting us to be part of this beautiful webinar series. We've really enjoyed preparing for today, and it feels like a great honour to be part of the conversation and even to get the last slot. So yeah, thank you so much for having us.
So as we begin, we'd like to ask you all, we are embodied practitioners. We work through an art form, through art forms. So we're not used to doing lots of talking. Well, actually, we do talk a lot, but not in this way about this work. So what we thought we'd like to start just by asking you, and I'm going to do it myself as well, asking you to just listen to your breath. This phrase, come into your body, whatever that means. Just remember your inner body. And we would like to light a candle. The three of us will light a candle. Our work is all about remembrance, and this is for us the simplest and very profound way, a very profound way of marking remembrance. So the three of us are going to do that. And those will hopefully, maybe, stay lit throughout, and we'll come back to them at the end. So we just wanted to encourage you to look around the space that you're in, and check in with yourself, check in with the space, and just connect with your breath. Emily.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd also like to welcome you into this space in Welsh, which is the Indigenous language of where I am right now and where I'm from. So croeso, diolch yn fawr I dod. Welcome and thank you for coming. And as Rachel said, let's just arrive in whatever space we are. We're in this collective digital space together and in our separate physical spaces. So let's just arrive into our space, have a little wiggle and a little shake, come into your body. And I'm going to hand over now to Percy.
As we start, we give thanks to the guides and communities that inspire and hold us, close to home, far afield, human, more than human, past, present, future. We give thanks to the earth that holds us all. Thanks for their generous and miraculous life-giving systems. We give thanks for the people and cultures whose lives, labour and creativity support the ongoingness of the earth. And we give thanks for your presence, time, labour and openness to being here today. We acknowledge the severity of the situations of this time. We remember the communities, creatures, species and webs of life and relations harmed, killed, and some driven extinct by the violent forces of oppression. We grieve and remember every drop of blood and every life taken through structural violences, and give thanks for all that survives and still continues to thrive and grow and surprise. Everything here is done with and from love as devotion to the earth. We offer our fierce love in service to life. Thank you. The opportunity to share with you today the story of our work as Feral Theatre and exploring the themes of extinction and remembrance means a lot to us, because in telling our story, we deepen our understanding of the journey, and we kind of see ourselves as part of a greater journey and a movement, which is always in process and always changing and emerging. So just by listening here and being part of a conversation with us, you're helping to shape the work, and we're grateful for that. Rachel and Emily are two of my very best friends and two of my very oldest friends. We've been working together since the year 2000, when we were all working as puppeteers and theatre makers at a tiny little theatre in North London called the Little Angel Puppet Theatre. And so we sort of bonded in the process of making creative work. And then we all started families around the same time. And when we were all in that sort of rather chaotic and amorphous period of having young children, we started to make playful work to entertain our kids and our babies. And but obviously there was a drive, there was a kind of there was an aspirational drive there to do it well. So in 2007 we set up Feral Theatre. And we began with a project in which we worked exclusively outdoors and focused on making performances on the solstices, the equinoxes, the quarters and the cross quarters of the wheel of the year. So there was an overarching ritual structure with the timing of the performances, and each one took a ritual structure within that overarching shape. They were playful, they were rough, it was unfunded work, it was all participatory, and we felt that the themes worked for participants and audiences of all ages. And we worked in role, clowning, puppeting, but making these experimental DIY, very sort of light touch rituals in theatre. And it was precarious, and it was marginal, and it was brilliant. And a great pleasure to be in that space with good friends. Now that we kind of moved into another phase as our children, mine and my oldest child and Rachel's are the same age, and they started school in 2009. And it was at that point that there was the 15th UN Climate Change Convention, the COP15, and it was in Copenhagen. And it had, alongside the official process, there were what were at that point the largest ever protests, climate change protests on the streets around the conference centre. And there was also like hundreds of thousands of activists and thinkers and energetic, passionate people arriving into that city from across Europe and the world. And they were setting up experimental communities and sort of pop-up utopias, or just showing different ways other than business as usual. It was very idealistic and kind of energized, but what happened was that the conference was profoundly unproductive. And so there was this dissonance, this weird dissonance between all the sense of possibility from the grassroots and the kind of crushing complexity of the bureaucratic and the compromises of the bureaucratic process that were happening inside the institutions. And also, as a parent of a young child, or as any carer, or anyone with any kind of mobility issues, or the issues around traveling, or commitments to being in work or in place, like there was a lot of frustration that my way of showing my concern or my care didn't fit into this kind of oppositional binary of like activist or policy maker or policy lobbyist. It was, this kind of sense of alienation really pervading a lot of people's feelings of basically despair around climate conference processes. And yeah, it was kind of a threshold for me, like a maturing threshold moment, because I couldn't go. There's a kind of feeling of being stuck, lots of difficult feelings around this futility, frustration, but also underneath it, this kind of these terrible feelings of panic and loss. And by coincidence, a couple of months after the COP15, I went to see my friend Alina Azadeh, as an installation and visual artist, and also now a writer. She made an extraordinary installation that was shown at Bristol Gallery. It was a piece about grief because her mother had died in the tsunami in Thailand in 2004. And I participated in this big project that she asked 1,000 people to give gifts, and she made a tidal wave form out of these wrapped and bound gifts that people had given her, that them letting go of things that they were attached to. And then from seeing that in Bristol Gallery, I went up into the Natural Sciences room in Bristol Museum, which is in the same building, and I kind of sat there digesting Alina's installation, and I literally looked up and saw an animal that I'd never seen before in a glass cabinet right next to me, and it was a kind of lit thing that looked like a bit cross between a dog and a tiger, and it was a thylacine, which is also known as a Tasmanian tiger, and I'd never even heard of this animal. And I was looking at, and it said it was extinct, and it was a kind of coming together of these various quite excruciating forms. I had a very sort of strong image then and there wanting to smash the case that the thylacine was in and bury it or wash it to have some kind of ritual letting go, and then yes, it was a kind of, there was a powerful image that was came as a kind of gift at that moment. And then after that, the Conservative government got into power after we'd had a decade or so of Labour in power here in the UK, and lots of climate activists and carers got together to organise a candlelit midnight vigil outside the Houses of Parliament as soon as the Tories got in. And with some local friends, somehow the idea came that we'd kind of make a pop-up graveyard for lost species, and we'd an extinct species, and we'd put it outside the front door of the House of Commons. So we kind of made paper lanterns, and we took masks of animals. The two friends were Tom Daniel and Jessie Martlehoff Johnson, and we went to sit outside the House of Parliament, and people came and sat and reflected and paid their respects all through the night. And then that led back into the work with Rachel and Emily. Emily.
Thank you, Percy. So in 2011, after the climate vigil at the Houses of Parliament, we applied for funding to create a site-specific show. And Percy came up with this title, A Funeral for Lost Species. The show was directed by Rachel, and the performers were myself, Percy, Lex Titterington, and Zoot Lyman. And we devised this show together. I think Percy's going to screen share some images. I think there's some images of the vigil, and then there's some images from the Funeral for Lost Species. We also worked with a much larger cast of amazing kind of volunteer performers, local artists and art students around Brighton, and we created a graveyard for extinct species in a real graveyard at St. Peter's Church in Brighton. And some of these artists created graves and shrines to extinct species. So you can see there the Palestinian painted frog, and that's the Caribbean monk seal shrine there. Here's the elephant bird. So the premise of the show was that we were a team of celestial funeral directors, and it was our job to ensure that every species who became extinct got a suitable send-off, and somehow that was ensuring the continuity of existence. And it really parodied the kind of mainstream environmental movement, and we really wanted to sort of shine a light on the sort of desacralizing drive that we're experiencing now, and the clash between science and spirituality. So we had two central characters played by Percy and myself, of the kind of high priestess Augusta Mysticity, who was all about the spirit, and Ms. Owl, who was all about the science. We reprised these roles in a lot of our shows following this first one, to explore these kind of polarities of science and spirit through their difficult relationship. I think we were all really feeling the kind of absence of feelings in the activist movement and in the environmental movement. And Percy, I think, are you ready to share the film? So we have a short film of the show, which Percy's gonna share now, and I will talk you through it. It's only 4 minutes long. So this is a cenotaph that I created with all the names of extinct species from islands on it, on all four sides. There's the golden toad, which was a very recent extinction. That's the passenger pigeon memorial. There's the monk seal again. So a lot of our work followed a kind of three-part ritual structure. So our performances were kind of like performance rituals. And we always started with humor and kind of drawing the audience in. We'd all studied clowning. And you can see Lex there, I don't know if you saw that, doing her amazing kind of artistic version of BSL, British Sign Language. So that was incorporated into the show as well. So it started off funny, and then there was this kind of move where we went around the back of the church. And this was really kind of in the second act, discovering the kind of bloody face of mass extinction. So what became apparent is that the celestial garden of lost species can't cope with the number of extinctions. And actually what mass extinction is really about is this: it's chaos, it's dead bodies, it's blood, it's dead animals. So this is the kind of reality, and the narrative thread of the whole piece was kind of lost. And then there's this moment where the audience came back together. All of our shows have a kind of participatory element. So here the audience held onto this long white piece of fabric and processed into the church. Procession is also a really, really important part of our work. And they were singing as well. It's a very simple song. Inside the church, we had this massive shadow screen, and a beautiful colleague of ours, Kate Salter, did this amazing shadow drawing. And here is the Baiji. So the funeral was centered around the Baiji, the Yangtze River dolphin, which is another very recent extinction. And all of our funerals for lost species kind of centered on an endling. So it was about the last of that species. And this was the last Baiji that this funeral was about. Here's the audience filing out. And they have these bird puppets. And it was really interesting how people were very, very moved by the show. There's some interviews at the end of the film here about people's thoughts about the show, and people were really, really moved. by the show. And what we didn't realize, I think, when we were devising this work is that, of course, it would bring up all the different kinds of losses that people have in their lives, all of their personal losses. And there's a few more images here of some of the shrines that were in the graveyard. We always served tea and cake after our performances and allowed our audiences to kind of digest what they'd seen, because as you can probably see from the film, there were quite sort of extreme moments in that. There was quite a lot to digest. So we always like to provide a space for people to talk about their feelings and what they had felt in their bodies during the show. So this show was followed by a number of other performative endling funerals, and that autumn in 2011 we started Remembrance Day for Lost Species as an annual day for mourning ecological loss, and Percy's going to talk about that a little bit later. But first I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to talk about some of the theory that underpins our work and where who inspired us on this journey.
Thank you, Emily. What I'm going to do is focus on the performance that Emily's just talked about, the one you saw the video of, because the ideas and theory that underpinned that performance, because this particular performance is very relevant as it was a turning point for us. We suddenly identified a desire to combine our activism, our theatre making and ritual with a new dynamism. And that show formed a kind of template for the future rituals and performances to come. At that stage, we'd had numerous influences, actually too many to list, but I will name some of them, influences at that time. Since then and now there's even more, but we've got Arnold van Gennep, Victor Turner, Billy Lindqvist, Richard Schechner, Welfare State International and the Dead Good Guides, Peter Brook, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Rachel Carson, us some. As the director of that show, I was influenced by the drama therapy lineage that I was trained in. That's called Sesame, which always utilizes a structure that consists of a focus, a main event, and a grounding. It consists of more, but essentially, those are the bare bones of the structure. And what I realized is it mirrored the ritual structure that Arnold van Gennep identified and Victor Turner built upon, particularly in his book, Ritual Process, but I think it influenced everything he did. Essentially, at this stage of the project, Remembrance Day for Lost Species was built upon the idea of preliminal, liminal, and postliminal phases of ritual process. The piece opens with the entrance into the world of the characters. There's a separation from the normal world, and this begins the preliminal. It takes place in through clown-like characters that are driving this introduction, this comedic introduction in front of the church. The audience is, through that introduction, is pulled into this imaginal world through comedy. It's light, it's not confrontational. People, in theory, and I think it worked, relaxed and started to become immersed through the comedy into this world of these characters. And as you heard, each character represented something very important in terms of the thinking behind the piece. So that happened in the front of the church. That was preliminal. The transition into the liminal stage begins when the audience is walked to the back of the church, outside of the church, where they witness the horrors and chaos of deaths that have been hidden away and they shouldn't have been seen, as you heard. The audience in that staging have no collective place to bear witness. The ground is a bit uneven. They're dotted around the graveyard irregularly. This is disturbance. It's otherworldly, nightmarish even. And the masks that the characters present at the beginning are dropped. The characters break down. They literally break down. They cry. They say, no, don't come here. They panic. So there's this huge shift, and it's uncomfortable. So that's the liminal phase. I'm simplifying here for the sake of time, but then we move into the post-liminal phase, which begins as the audience walks together with the performers to the inside of the church. There are beautiful images, as you saw, soothing, uplifting music. People are sitting in rows now. Things become more regulated again, reorganized, because now we are reincorporating, which is what happens in that post-liminal phase. There is a melancholic release. The audience is immersed visually, musically, atmospherically in the beauty of the Baji. Collectively, we remember and maybe begin to bring together threads of our process from the beginning of the performance to this point. Drama therapeutically, we're bridging out of the main event, which is that liminal stage. And we know non-verbally, the audience senses that these gentle melodics and rhythms are leading us out of the intensity of the depth work of that liminal phase, that main event, back into our known world. As people leave the church, they can eat and drink, as Emily said. There is time to digest on numerous levels. Digest what they've seen, digest what they've felt and what they're feeling. As we eat together, we ground ourselves in the old world where we started before we began this journey. But the old world, but with a new sense of something, a new awareness of a grief that maybe for the first time, be shared as if it is an embodied thing. Even if we don't have words for the enormity of the losses of extinction, our bodies through the performance can feel it, journey through it, and share it with others. The ritual structure here is organic in its universality, as we see this shape in rituals, stories, and rites of passage all over the world. It acts as a container for complex, layered experiences of ecological grief, even guilt, even shame, that we can become split off from in our Anthropocenic disconnectedness. We were attempting to center the experience of the audience. We perceive the performance as a journey, and for some even maybe a rite of passage into this new reality of mass extinction. So I'm going to finish this little bit with a quote from Victor Turner. What they seek is a transformative experience that goes to the root of each person's being and finds in that root something communal and shared.
Thank you.
To you, Percy.
I just wanted to check in. We've only got about another 10 minutes, so I'm gonna go quite quickly through the next bit. I'm going to show people some amazing photographs of the DIY rituals for the Anthropocene that we were kind of propelled into exploring and encouraging from this experience. And I wanted to say that although we had a great energy and we're doing a lot of this work ourselves, it was very much part of a movement and a moment, and the invitation that we shared for building on from the funeral to the idea of a day of remembrance for lost species. The invitation was taken up very, very widely, and there have been actually countless project allies, supporters, loving friends, advisors, amazing, inspiring artists and thinkers who have worked on and supported this initiative. And I don't have time to name them, but they're deeply important. So I'm going to just show you some pictures and talk through them for a couple of minutes. Sorry. They're my notes, you don't want to see them. Okay, so the next thing we did a processional funeral for a tiger subspecies. We did, and then in November we invited funerals for the great auk. It's a relatively recent Anthropocene extinction. And I helped to organise a procession in Brighton with my good friends here, and we did an actual burial. We attempted a burial at sea of this sculpture. Then with Feral Theatre, the larger company who were involved with the play, we held another 2 tiger subspecies funerals. Funeral for the Bali tiger, sorry, we've done that. Funeral for the Javan tiger, and then, which was amazing, it was a collaboration with the Gamelan Orchestra at the South Bank Centre, where the ghost of the Javan tiger was sort of brought back to life and then laid to rest. And then with a shrine, finishing with a shrine, which was co-created by children in the audience at the end of the event. And similarly, this happened at the Uncivilization Festival following summer, marking the Caspian tiger. We made a website and put out the call. You can see the language is quite specific language that has changed over the years, but the idea is that it's not just about looking backwards, it's about looking at historical patterns with a view to understanding contemporary and ongoing drivers of change. We often had a call, a themed call or a thematic to explore. That's changed over the years. You'll see it's very much been a trajectory away from endling stories in the first half of the project's lifespan to something more kind of complicated and probably harder to get on board with, which Emily will talk about in a minute. But I've got a couple of pictures. This is lots of museums around the world have participated and often collaborating with artists. So here you can see the curators actually opened up a cabinet and let a young person hold a taxidermied passenger pigeon. There's a procession for extinct and endangered pollinators. This was a bench project in South London with passers-by declaring their love for pollinators. This was the pollinator procession in Lake Merritt, which is organised by our very dear friend and ally, Megan Hollingsworth, who's come up with the term of regenerative memorials, where any memorial event needs to be connected. And she would advocate that it should be connected to ecological restoration work on a day around that. So for her, this was about planting milkweed and foliage and flowers that would support monarch butterflies specifically, but all pollinators in general. This was the next year. We had a procession to mark the extinction of the passenger pigeon, and this was walking up to the Life Cairn, which is a stone cairn in Sussex that was founded by some of the people in this picture, including our good friend Andreas Corneville. This is one of Emily's pieces showing the disappearing flocks of passenger pigeons on Poppet Sands in Wales. There was a theme exploring marine endangerment, and so we had it's a team of, they were called the Urban Divers, went around Glasgow at some point doing synchronized scuba snorkeling in shopping centres, looking for a lost fish. Sorry, that sounds trite. They were talking about where's lost species of that neighbourhood and kind of reimagining Glasgow as it might have been at a different time or in a different timeline. And this was the last procession that I organised. It was in 2018. This is still a sea cow. We built it on board the ONCA barge. ONCA has supported in an unstinting way Lost Species Day, and through commissions and space and time and organisational energy from everybody in that team, we built this Stella's sea cow in our venue, which was a boat in Brighton Marina. And then we carried it through the multi-story car park. It's a pretty anthropocenic image in the drizzle, in the twilight, through a tunnel, past Asda and down to the beach, and burnt Stella's sea cow. Then we moved online, which Rachel's going to talk about a little bit, and the kind of, so you'll see the images have changed, and the way that people have engaged with the initiative has changed as well since the pandemic. Rachel will talk more about this, but you know what we were able to do thanks to ONCA again, and you know Arts Council funding, was to pay amazing artists and thinkers, speakers, educators, you know, inspirational practitioners to share their perspective and kind of problematize this idea of ecological remembrance, or the idea of species, the idea of extinction. So these are just some pictures from some of the amazing online talks and experimental rituals that we've hosted. This was a collaboration with an amazing company called Parallel Effect in Australia, who organised a 4-hour vigil for an extinct handfish. Yeah, and this is B. Sue, who's a transpersonal psychotherapist and ritualist, who's held some very very unique sort of guided meditations and rituals for us online. And this is a picture from a spell casting workshop, a spell casting session that 3 of us held this November just past. We called it Spells to Bind Giants. Okay.
Thanks, Percy. So because we're short of time, I'm gonna go through this as quickly as I can, but we wanted to talk a little bit about our move kind of away from science-led, taxonomy-led, the focus on species and endlings, into much more work that was sort of thinking much more systemically and structurally. So I think that I think in the early days there were a few things that kind of blinded us to a deeper understanding of our work. One of them, and possibly the most significant, was that being white and middle class, we live within a system where we're not encouraged to step out of our comfort zones and ask ourselves difficult questions. Another is that, as I think Percy said earlier, we loved the work. We were so immersed in it, and we just loved doing it that we weren't really, you know, looking at it with a critical eye. And also, and especially for Persephone and myself, you know, we are nature nerds, and we love taxonomy, we love the science, we loved the kind of researching the science of extinction, and in some ways that kept us in a problematic space. So Lost Species Day emerged alongside a few other artist-led projects like Dark Mountain, Extinction Witness, and The Life Cairn, which Percy mentioned, exploring the theme of mass extinction. So something was really being tapped into here, but the networks that we were allied to really were made up of people who looked like us, white privileged people, confronting the failings of capitalism and consumerism, but not really looking at the sort of racialized power structures that make up those systems. There was a sort of failure to understand the histories of settler colonialism and extractive capitalism, and how both impact disproportionately on Indigenous people, Black people and people of colour, poor and working class people, as well as biodiversity. So the impacts are intrinsically linked, and capitalism is predicated on these systems of extraction and oppression. And what we really noticed, you know, as I've said, is that the mainstream Western environmental movement seems to be just made up of people who are really the beneficiaries of systems like capitalism. So we also started thinking more deeply about our love of Western science and taxonomy, and how it's really intertwined with white supremacist ways of thinking. So the study of natural history is a kind of exercise in ordering and separating, and it's very much along hierarchical lines. The foundations of natural history are really found in sort of extractive settler colonialism and collecting. And of course, many of the extinct species, some of the ones we've mentioned today, like Steller sea cow, bear the names of colonial collectors. So we began to feel that an initiative like Lost Species Day, unless it was examined a bit more closely and critically, was really irrelevant, particularly for people who are socioeconomically marginalised, people on the front lines of climate breakdown, people affected by conflict and colonialism, queer and trans people facing hate crimes, and the people whose lives were entwined with endangered species and places. And we also began to realise that there was a whole other world of environmental activism out there, rarely talked about in the mainstream European media, but people on the front line enacting change in the global south. And in fact, in different parts of our own neighbourhood, on small scale, kind of grassroots planes. So we did a lot of learning and reading and asking and reflecting, and we realised that by focusing on stories of extinct species without discussing harms to people and culture, we were really perpetuating white environmentalism's history of cultural erasure. So this was our decolonial practice, basically. And we made commitments to turn to Black, queer, Indigenous, non-white activists, organisations and artists and academics for wisdom. And we were massively influenced, again, by a whole raft of people, Adrian Marie Brown and Donna Haraway, those were our two main influences, but lots of other people as well. In 2019, we published an essay called On Racism and Environmental Practice, A Journey. I would say that journey is still ongoing. That letter's still on the Lost Species Day website. But I think we've moved on in some ways since then. But it was really a sort of statement of intent to pay attention to and amplify the voices of people living through entwined genocides and ecocides, to make links between rather than to separate the story of harms to people and to non-humans, and to acknowledge that as the beneficiaries of white supremacy, we have a duty to speak and act on racism from our position of safety. The essay also responded to Extinction Rebellion, who had kind of exploded onto the activist scene. And so I'm sorry I whizzed through that all very quickly, but the essay's there if you want to read it. And I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to talk a bit more about this change of direction in our work, and also how we responded to the sort of new ways of working during the pandemic. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you. I'm realising we're quite over time, so I'm just wondering if it's all right for us to go over, or if I should cut a bit out now. And
there are only 2 questions in the queue.
Right.
Oh, there's 4 now.
Yeah, you can finish up. We can add a few minutes on the end. That's okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
So let me find my place. So COVID and its lockdowns had a huge impact on our practice. It coincided with this paradigmatic turning point in our approach. Alongside the drive to decolonize our work and integrate it with anti-racist and queer practice, we were literally forced to step out of our embodied artistic practice and work with more physical distance and intellectual objectivity. Our inner process through those lockdowns was being externalized with the forced geographic distance. With less proximity, more reflexivity emerged. As our Remembrance Days for Lost Species became online events, we had to detach from our beloved performer selves, and maybe then something of our egoic attachment to the form of our work loosened a bit. We saw our own ritual events as a potential platform for other ritualists, educators, scholars, writers, artists, activists, with voices more marginalized and more radical than our own. This was a wonderful and vital time of transition. And in moments, it felt like this whole thing we started had become a movement that was bigger than anything we ever could have imagined. In the space that grew between us in terms of not being able to be together physically, our feral and practice together artistically, we noticed a growing, this is in our feral practice, we noticed a growing reticence and even trepidation that some of you might recognize in making mistakes that could be harms. So it feels important to name that and recognize this willingness to move away from the comfort zone of known practices as a really healthy step in one's artistic and social growth. And we want to reframe that fear and freeze response to mistake making as really normal. And at stages that's even necessary in terms of this transitory phase that we actually were exploring in our performances before we were thinking about these things. Though it's a stage, okay, this is a little bit careful. We realize it is a stage to move through this caution. This cautious stage is one to move through watchfully, as the dangers are, and it happened to us, that one crushes other people's offerings and openings, for example, in these events. If the things that, if we're working with these ideas as mere ideology, because really it's about relationship with people, with everybody, and it's about opening and not closing down. And I think in the beginning it can feel like a closing down. So these are things to think about, to be careful of. So I want to take us back, before I finish, to those three influences I named before: Van Gennep, a folklorist, Turner, anthropologist, and Lindqvist, who is the drama therapist who created Sesame drama therapy that I'm trained in. These three and others like them could be seen as extractivist and appropriative in their infiltration of indigenous African communities and their distillation of living practices that were not theirs to disseminate. It feels important to name that an event, our event, which centered speaking out against ecological injustice, was built upon possible extractivist research and practice. And yet still we cannot escape the influences. Within them are elements that have transformed us positively, but we face the harmful histories that some of the ideas of ritual and environmentalism have grown from, that influenced us. So this idea of liminality stays with us. Indeed, I think that we three are still in a liminal phase as we decolonize our practice. It seems that anti-racism for us is an ongoing transitional state. And I've got a lovely quote here from an academic whose name I can't pronounce. It's spelt Szakholczai. It's a beautiful name, and maybe we can put that in the chat. And he wrote this piece in 2009, and I'd like to finish this with the quote: "The dissolution of order during liminality creates a fluid, malleable situation that enables new institutions and customs to be established." So we're now at the end of the talk. We're transitioning into time for questions, but I just want to bring our focus back to these three candles that Percy, Emily, and I lit in the beginning. And I'm asking you to come back to your breath, to pay attention to the way it rises and falls in your body, and maybe begin to slow your breathing down. deepen the breath. And I'm wondering what feelings you might be left with, if any. You don't need to name anything. All we ask is that you notice if there are tensions, release, uplift, heaviness, buzzing, calm, and just accept whatever is there. And if you'd like to make a physical gesture of release or whatever you feel now, because remembering we have bodies, we are people in bodies. And now I'd like to ask Percy to bring up on the screen, if you haven't already, these images. And I'm just going to hold the candle up while we finish with these images of some of the lost species that we have remembered in our rituals. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We will blow our candles out. And we'd like to, yeah, great. Hand over to Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's wonderful to hear not only about what you've done in your experience, but also to be invited into ritual through those photos and through the candles and breathing. So as you said, we're running a little bit long on the talk, but I don't want to end without having some time for Q&A. So even if we go a bit over, let's take some time to do Q&A. So we'll use the Q&A function. You can submit questions through it. We may not get through everything that gets asked, but we'll do some. So maybe I'll start with the first question that came through is just about you've done these funerals multiple times over the years, and the question is, does the repetition of the performance weaken the experience for you? I mean, it's an interesting question because in a sense you're intentionally ritualizing, but what does the ritualizing of something over and over again do to the experience of it?
Well, I think personally, I think it deepens it over the years. We probably will do these rituals for the rest of our lives. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, or the repetition of the actual performances, the same performances, but we didn't repeat the performances ever very much anyway. And each ritual is kind of recreated with a similar structure in mind. It was for some years. But for me, the repetition has really deepened my relationship with the grief, with these complex things, and also the situations in our world are intensifying and changing all the time. So it doesn't feel like it's ever too much or weakened by the repetition. I don't know what you two think.
I'd agree. I think ritual takes practice. It needs practice, and the more you do it, whatever kind of, we were really interested in DIY rituals and making up your own rituals, and the more you do them, I think the sort of, as Rachel said, the deeper it goes, but also there's a sort of familiarity that starts to creep in, which is actually really nice. Like, you slightly feel like you know what you're doing, which I think, coming from a very secular background like I do, where I was not brought up with any of those sorts of rituals, religious sacred rituals were very absent from my life. So it really helped, I think, to do rituals. But yes, in terms of performances, we never did them very often. The one on the South Bank was a one-off, I think. Did we just do that once? And the Funeral for Lost Species, I think 5 performances or something like that. It was, yeah, we weren't on tour doing long, doing 8-week runs. No, not that kind of performance.
Call it iterative and reflective. So there's a sort of there's an evolutionary relationship to the ritual, and a kind of a drawing in of ideas or influences from other people's efforts. So it becomes a kind of well, I won't go into there's a kind of it's always emerging rather than something that's static.
Yeah.
Another question is ask you to talk about the choice of the church and the churchyard, and is wondering if this could be taught as a template for communities to do in their own community. So in answering that, I wonder maybe if you could talk too about, I mean, you've talked about this kind of decolonial, anti-racist journey you've been on, whether the template would look different that you would recommend now in thinking about recommending this for local communities to do in churchyards.
We only did one thing in a churchyard, didn't we? The first thing, and we did talk a lot about how, like, that church wasn't being used as a church at all. It's a very small, very, very old church in Brighton. I think it's the oldest church in Brighton. But the congregation has dwindled away, and it's now used, by people like us, I guess, for sort of art events and things. So we did talk about that, kind of like the idea of repurposing these sacred spaces for a new kind of sacred event or practice. But I don't know, what do you think? I think we feel like people should do them wherever they feel moved to do it. Yeah, multi-story car parks.
And if a church is what does it for you, I think following your what feels true for you is really important. Like, it's important that we don't tell you where you should and shouldn't be doing the performances. I find with ritual, it's so personal, and if you feel like you're going through motions, it doesn't mean so much. So it's, if you need to do it in a church, I mean, it's a lovely idea, but for some people they just won't be able to do that. And I also love the idea of it being done, like you say, in a I don't know, a shed, or even on your own, on your sofa.
Well, lots of people do it outside as well. Like, it's a form for worship and communion with the more than human, and it's very people design their own process and ritual according to what they want to get out of it. Or it's all very experimental and non-prescriptive. There are templates. You can find templates, and as Rachel's talked about, you've got that sort of that structure, that 3-part structure that often runs through. But people have done all sorts of memorials and events in countless contexts. I did have a slide showing where they'd happened, but I forgot to add it to the slideshow. But they've been in hundreds and hundreds of different sorts of places. But lots of churches too, actually. There are a number of religious practitioners and Christians who are in Christian ecology is definitely becoming more embedded in some practitioners' work. We don't have a strong connection with the Christian community particularly, but I'm aware that there are a number of leaders who will mark the day or use ecological language in some of their services, and particularly on November the 30th.
Yes, and we were in fact supported very strongly by, is it Peter Owen Jones?
Yes, and Alex, there's another called Alex in Brighton.
Yeah,
Alex
at
Mans.
The beginning of our journey, who are both vicars. Yeah.
So another question is, how do you measure success in the events, or what changes in awareness the participants have? What makes the events more than performative? And the question asks or clarifies, I'm curious, not accusatory.
It's a brilliant question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a really it's a complicated question, and I think I know that I certainly have moments where I feel like, what am I doing? This isn't like, how is this affecting change in the world? Which I think was what we all kind of want to do, really. But I think sometimes if you're engaged in the arts, it's very difficult to see what change is happening. And I have moments where I feel like, oh, I want to be on the Sea Shepherd, fighting whalers in the middle of the Pacific or something, like something really concrete and easier to measure in terms of like, oh, I saved that whale's life, and it's not, what we do certainly is not that. It's not easy to measure. I mean, I would say feeling like part of a movement is really important for me personally, like feeling part of something bigger that's happening feels like an important thing.
I mean, we're talking about a generation or a time in history when people are confronting, you could call it these hyper objects like climate change, or the idea of, massive ecological changes that are very, very, very hard for us to get our heads around, as well as our hearts and our consciousnesses generally. It's new, it's quite new for humans to have to think about this kind of stuff. Like, we've had to deal with all sorts of pain and struggle and grief and loss, but these things that are bigger than our ancestors ever had to kind of process, like I don't think it's going to be a sort of success or fail thing. Like, we're working our way through, we're bearing witness to an incredible transitional period. And I think the kind of where I experience feelings of success or happiness or pleasure is where I feel like the shared language, the shared emergent language is breaking out of silos, or I'm finding commonalities with people doing work that I find inspirational or in some way connected to my own practice in other parts of the world. And that sense that there is a kind of a field of experience and conceptualizing struggle that's growing and deepening and getting more powerful and more politicized. It's like a kind of, maybe it's tools for resilience, tools for solidarity. That's when it feels like it's successful, I suppose. But also for me, sometimes successful is just like, if I personally might get to release some emotion or get out of my head and into a different part of my experience.
Yeah, I think that's
private as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what you say about solidarity is really important as well, Percy. And I think sometimes for me, it's about sort of really small acts of resistance and like just being a thorn in the side of these huge kind of massive structures like capitalism, that we're so like every cell in our body is kind of caught up with that. It's like this sort of thunderous machine, but to think that you can just be a thorn in the side of it feels really important to me. Like, I love that movement of rest as resistance, like I don't know if people know that, the NAP ministry, but just by resting is an anti-capitalist act. I think I love things like that, where like, let's all find our little way of being anti-capitalist, and that in a small way, or some people might do it in a big way, but yeah, I'm okay most of the time. I'm okay with doing it in a small way.
It would be interesting to do a research project. I'm always fascinated in that. So, it would be interesting to do that. And in terms of research, there's no formal research, but what was surprising to us was how fast this grew and spread, how many people started to like it all over the world. And it became so big, it was taken on by what are they called again?
Extinction Rebellion.
And we were watching writers like, lots of famous people doing a thing for an extinct animal that they, it became huge. And to me, that is evidence you know, so it'd be interesting to do something around this. Also, evidence is that people say to us over and over again how moved they were, how it's changed something for them or just opened up awareness. So feedback from participants is the thing that kind of drives us on, and in a way it's anecdotal, but it is evidence of something.
Thank you. Let's end with one last question. I wish we could get to more, but I'd really like to ask this one. I'll just read it out. Astonishing, right on, powerful work. Gratitude for your ongoing practice and questioning. I love so much the vital attention to other creatures, to the endlings, the specificity of other beings. I wonder how the necessary decolonial investigations and questioning can be done without inadvertently swiveling our awareness entirely back into the human frame to the exclusion of other species. Could you say a bit about this?
Thank you. That's a good question. And it's one that has been on our lips, and many people who have been working with us have asked it too.
Yeah, I think it's really important, isn't it? But it instantly makes me think of the idea of separation. Like, this is part of, I think, the reason why we're in the place where we are now, which is not a great place to be. I think we would all agree, is this idea of separating human and non-human. Like, that in itself is you know, has not been a great idea. It's not served us as a species well, let alone other species. So yeah, I would argue that even if you're just looking at humans, we are part of the natural world as well. I'm sure Percy's got stuff to say about this, and Rachel.
It's definitely something that we're struggling with, and you know, as I alluded to in a rush while I was going through the slideshow, you know, our discomfort with our sort of paradoxical longing to pay intimate attention to one story, because that one story of, you know, what happened to Martha, you know, the last passenger pigeon in Cincinnati Zoo, or what happened to that egg, that great auk egg on the beach when the sailor stood on it. You know, those stories are they're so intense, and it's, you know, we just felt this kind of mandate to learn them and tell them and like repeat them. And then this awareness of how coloniality had kind of informed our approach and our kind of frame of questioning and thinking, and then really just trying to kind of step back from that. What's happened is we've kind of, I feel like the question that David, thank you for your question, I appreciate it. It's the question is asking, it's like I feel like we're going somewhere else. We're kind of moving through a kind of, we've unraveled, and maybe there's a kind of re-raveling, or maybe there's just a kind of a letting go and a kind of understanding that this project is truly pluralistic, it's truly decentralized, and it needs to kind of go the whatever way it's going to go, and to sort of just trust the process of trust the decolonizing process, and trust that it's never over, and that it's non-linear. And I suppose I kind of want to be able to tell those tiny stories, and I want to be able to be really, really critical as well. And, you know, in my intellect and my ferocity and my rage, and I want to be sort of platforming the most amazing, badass thinkers and artists that I possibly can as well. So I feel like we can kind of hold multitudes. And I suppose I've got lots of feelings, and they're kind of coming out in a rush, but I think probably there's so many answers to that question. And I would like to kind of do more humble inquiry and learning about all sorts of, you know, indigenous cosmologies and ways of life, you know, where this kind of sense of separation is, as Emily said, you know, not even a thing.
I think I sort of, as you're talking, Percy, I was thinking of it a bit like a web, you know, where all these stories are connected. So if you're talking about the story of harms to a person or group of people, there will be harms associated to non-human life, like that's just how it works, that's how it goes. When I remember the first Gulf War, and it was obviously a human tragedy and a human disaster, but there were also all those seabirds on the beaches covered in oil, and I really remember that image because we were teenagers at the time, right? And I remember seeing all those cormorants flopping around on the beaches covered in oil. And so there's always, the stories are always connected, and there's no hierarchy. It's not that one story is more important than another. I think I see it like a web, and that we are just we're just following the different strands of the web, and hopefully other people are following their other strands as well. So we're all kind of connecting it up, maybe.
Beautiful. I don't have anything to add to that. Those to me are perfect answers.
It's a beautiful way to end. So let me once again thank you all so much for being with us today, for sharing with us, for the work that you've been doing and the work you'll continue to do. We'll look forward to seeing where this continues to go. So this is the end of our webinar series, and I just want to thank all of you who are here for joining us on this journey. I also just want to mention that we'll have one more event on the same theme this semester. So this is only maybe for those who are local to the New Haven area, but we'll be hosting an exhibition of the work of Angela Mano, which is titled Sacred Biodiversity Icons and Threatened and Endangered Species in April and May of this year. So keep an eye out for communications on that. There'll also be many more upcoming events from this initiative in the future. For now, our request for proposals is live. So if you're a scholar, an artist, a practitioner, and you're interested in putting together an event like this webinar series or like this upcoming exhibition or other options such as performance or a conference, please check out the request for proposals on the website, which I'll put in the chat one more time. And so again, I'll end by saying thank you to our speakers and thank you for all of you for being here.